So I think I'd like to start with Kate. Kate, more than anybody in government, and probably even outside of government, has a sort of finger on the pulse of the cultural life of the city. The dance companies, the theatre companies, the small museums, whose members who are drawn to the city were a magnet for those kind of people. They're definitely not part of the 1%. They probably think themselves lucky if they're part of the 50%, most of them. And they're undoubtedly struggling, as so many others we talked about today, looking for these types of affordable accommodations. So, Kate, I'd like to ask you how you think that cultural part of the city, which is such an important part of our city, is going to survive, given the discussion we had this morning.
I mean, I think, when all you have is a hammer, everything looks like a nail. So my predilection for thinking that the city's creative community is really important to preserve is, my own obsession. But that said, I think there is a lot of data that would support that. From the highest level, the fastest growing industry in New York right now is the tourism and hospitality industry. And last year, 50% of the 48 million visitors who came to New York came specifically for cultural activities and events. And the backbone of that industry is really this nonprofit world that is full of artists and designers and folks here doing all manner of creative things. And sometimes it doesn't emerge onto the travertine marble stage, but it's an incredibly yeasty substrate of what makes New York the place that it is. I would go farther and say that I think most exciting story to come out of the city of New York really in the past 20 years in terms of urbanism is the reemergence of the borough of Brooklyn as the place where people want to live and to be, and that's been done also on the backs of our creative sector. So I think it is increasingly urgent that we figure out how to take care of this particular population. One of the frustrations is, of course, there isn't a whole lot of accurate data about how many artists we have. Our terrific colleagues in the demographic office of the Department of City Planning have been poring over census data with us for years now. Best count we have is roughly 145,000 individuals who are willing to check one of the many boxes, some of which are ridiculous because they're right next to, say, sportscaster and other things that would comprise creatives. The categories you can check are designers, writers, authors. Why a writer is different from an author, I can't tell you. Artists, musicians, singers, actors, photographers, dancers, choreographers. No mention of directors, no real nuance about this sector. But 145,000 individuals is, not nothing, and we suspect it's way more because of all the folks who are actually, getting their 1099 from their job as a paralegal, but in fact are working in this sector. Just a couple of other interesting things. Per the census data, there's been a 34% increase in the number of artists in the city of New York between the 2000 and the 2010 census. And I think we would all agree anecdotally that neighborhoods like Bushwick and Williamsburg have been given a new profile. It's now starting in St. George and Staten Island. There's a significant population of artists that starting to positively transform that neighborhood. Another fact about artists, on average, higher educational attainment. 97% of artists have a high school diploma compared with under 80% of New York residents, but where it's a huge difference is in college degrees. 72% of artists have BAs compared to 32% of residents of New York. So, nothing is an absolute silver bullet here, but if you look at the indices of what artists are, what they do, and the skill set they bring to the city, they are, I would say, extraordinarily valuable. It's also the case that, New York is the biggest college town in the country, and we have over 44, we think it's probably closer to upwards of 50 degree programs in the fine arts and arts administration in this city, and we think there are between 40 and 50,000 students enrolled currently in those programs. So bottom line, where are they living, where are they going to live? This is hugely important to my constituency.
So Matt, this is your problem, I think, right? Not to put it all on you, but you are the primary deliverer of government side housing and support for lower income residents of the city. Do you see any solutions to the kind of thing that Kate's describing and the broader issue of affordability?
Pardon me. Well, on the solution side, I'm hoping that clearly solutions will be coming out of this process, as well as processes that we're currently engaged in, being led out of City Hall to better understand if regulatory reform needs to occur. More broadly speaking, I think I start from the premise that regulatory reform does need to occur in order to facilitate change. I think I wanted to maybe spend at least a couple of minutes talking about the need, the underlying need. So at least from the standpoint, and by the way, that was a brilliant use of the term yeasty substrate. That is, I'm so impressed and very intimidated to be
All
going
yours
on
anytime
afterwards.
you want.
So from the standpoint of the housing agency, I think we start from a very simple premise, and that is that we have to find ways to facilitate the production of the types of housing that New Yorkers need. The operative word obviously being need. As a general rule, I think we all know that we have an incredibly tight multifamily market, as evidenced by the fact that for as long as we can remember, we've had vacancy rates that have been sub 3%. However, if we drill down on the numbers, there's two specific areas in which it appears there's significant misalignment between the type of housing that our markets provide and the type of housing that tends to be demanded. The first we're all familiar with, and that's affordable housing. And the second market segment obviously receives much less attention, really is what we're talking about today, and those are smaller type units, more unconventional type units. When it comes to affordable housing, I think that we all, as New Yorkers, almost viscerally understand that there is significant unaccommodated demand in New York City. So I don't need to get into too many specifics there. We know it, but here are a couple of facts. About 1.4 million households, and that is relative to close to 3 million households in New York City, live at 60% of the area median income or less. Of that, about 50% of those households are paying more than 50% of their, or 50% or more, of their gross income to rent and or house burden. In terms of demand for small units, less conventional units, we know much less. But here is what we know. Coincidentally, there's also 1.4 million households, which are made up of one or two person homes. However, there's only 1 million studios and one bedrooms collectively throughout the entire city. Moreover, some of the less conventional small unit designs and market segments that are out there have shown or demonstrated significant demand to date, and that includes dorms and SROs and supportive housing. I think ultimately, if we want to remain on the cutting edge, if we want to remain innovative, if we want to have the type of housing market which is flexible and dynamic in responding to underlying market need, much of which is often changing and much of which often is unanticipated, as I think you're pointing to, we have to be willing to be brave in looking at new regulatory changes in order to facilitate that. What those specific changes are, I can't speak to definitively today. I do have some great faith that this will work in parallel with the work that is really being led out of City Hall that we are a part of, as is Bob and a number of other individuals will probably yield those answers.
Okay. So Bob, a common theme today has been, if we set aside the issue of affordability for a minute, the idea that there's a lot of building out there that's either underutilized or it could be repurposed, and one of the obstacles to doing that is a kind of the regulatory environment, which is probably outdated. So do you agree with that, and do you see opportunities to assist in the kind of things that were described this morning?
So that's a really loaded question, right, David?
Well, you knew it was coming.
So I knew it was coming, and certainly I was told that I might be crazy to come today. Before I sort of talk to that, there's really three things that have to happen in this sort of housing policy point, which is, one, you have to, and this is something you know that we do, is you have to do enforcement against landlords who use properties illegally and the wrong way. There are plenty of opportunities for people to take advantage of those less fortunate and put them in harm's way. and that's something that we in the mayor's office have been working on. In some sense, we've been making some strides, but we all know that we need to do more. The second is to work on education. There are many people that do take information in and process that and make a decision. Those who can actually make a decision in terms of knowing what's expected and being able to walk into a situation and understand how they'll be protected in case of a fire or an emergency. Certainly, there are a portion of New Yorkers that actually have the means to make a change and make a decision not to take the apartment that's 40% less than the one next door based on some information. And we've been doing that. We've been basically going to subway stations, papering in 11 languages, making sure that people understand the types of things that they could be walking into, the standard things like don't worry about heat, you can't take your mail here, and we've been doing this campaign, and in some sense, we as government have to do that, and we will continue. And then the third is what my colleague has mentioned, is that regulatory reform, everyone's on your edge of your seat, want to hear what we should do. And you know, from our perspective, we agree that there needs to be a change. I think legislators, as well as city agencies, and many of you are looking for what is the silver bullet. And I think we all realize that looking at what we saw today, there are lots of questions that come up when we talk about regulatory reform. So there's certainly the federal government with ADA requirements, there's the state government, and then there's the city government housing maintenance code, the building code, and of course my friend, the zoning resolution and density. So it does seem to me that we may be at a point in time like it was in the past where there's an opportunity to push a set of different pieces that touch those to allow for opportunities. And you know, some of the creative solutions I saw today, I kind of smile. I kind of think to myself, well, how is the fireman going to get in there? But ultimately, the city agencies, certainly my colleague Sal Casano at Fire and myself, we have been working to make things safer. For example, when we adopted the International Building Code, we actually require sprinklers in almost every residential property built today, whereas it wasn't like that in 1968 code. We are also identifying, these are some key things. Let me just throw out some ideas. The one thing is about relationship. So when you talk about sharing, and I love the concept, the immediate thing I think about in the supportive housing model is people go, okay, there's someone in charge, and in the supportive housing model, and we're all going to share the kitchen or the bathroom or the living space. And if it gets out of line, there'll be someone that comes in to make that right. If you were to translate that concept and just make it private, some of the concerns I get are, who's going to police that in a way that makes people feel comfortable to walk into that situation? So immediately, you might walk into it and have a set of expectations. But the relationship of how that's managed, if there's no strong management and there's no strong enforcement, that can degrade into a particular housing situation that nobody wants to live in. With regard to what's a rooming unit, you know, certainly, is it a requirement to have a bathroom? Is it a requirement to have a kitchen? And is it a requirement to have a 150 square foot room? It's really funny because everything I heard today is about living smaller. I might not be the only one, but you know, living smaller isn't necessarily the way I want to live all the time. So some of the opportunities that they talked about moving walls to allow for different opportunities for space sounds good, but you go talk to anyone else in the United States and they go, oh my God, you should see what they live in New York. Okay, they check in and they do check out, but what I'm saying is that they're small. And so if we want to make the city a place to come and live, we need to offer flexible solutions, but I'm of the opinion that they don't always have to be smaller. And which drives to the next point, which is it's about affordability, which drives to the question of how do you pay for it? and how do you finance it, and who's in charge of building it. So my sense is that you have to work on the financial equation piece, and you also have to figure out how to build bigger and better and modular. You know, those are the kinds of things that are going to start to transform our marketplace so that it doesn't necessarily have to be the old way we built buildings. You build buildings all the time. You build spaces all the time. If you sit in the same matrix, there's only so much margin that you can cut until you have to break the mold. My sense is that we're at that time where it's not just about building smaller. And then the last is unlocking the big value in the property. If the community is willing to take the property and not have a lot coverage of 98% in Whitestone, Queens, which, you know, I actually live in Queens. Not a lot of us do, but some of us do. And the whole reason we moved there is so that the lot coverage isn't 90%. So there is this push and pull with what people here think the people there want, and unlocking the value. If you unlock the zoning value, you will get development. And you will make it less, make it more affordable, and you don't necessarily have to be smaller.
Well, that's a good segue to Tom, because there's obviously been a long-standing relationship between zoning and stimulating housing production through rezonings, the MX districts, and so on. So do you see opportunities there that city planning might introduce?
Well, sure. I think since the beginning of the Bloomberg administration, we've rezoned over 100 neighborhoods in the city. And in almost every instance, what we do is we look for opportunities to upzone, and we try to upzone areas that are within a 10-minute walk of a transit hub, so that it's, you know, this is just a way of fostering sustainable development. Oftentimes, at the same time, what we will do is we'll downzone other areas of that same neighborhood to give greater protection, to contextual protection, to parts of those neighborhoods that are further from transit. And that's one way of actually selling the rezoning to the communities that ultimately have to accept it. And these rezonings ultimately have to be adopted by the city council. So it's a balancing act between increasing the supply of housing within areas that are easily walkable to transit nodes, and also offering some level of protection to outlying areas that otherwise might be developed in a way that might be perceived as not entirely in the best interest of those outlying areas of the neighborhood. But what that does is it just allows for increased housing production, but under the same rules as we have today. And basically those rules were set in place in 1961 with the zoning resolution that we basically have today as our base. And that came out of over a 10-year discussion, citywide discussion, about what the city of New York, how the city of New York ought to develop. There was a great concern in the 1950s that, you know, New York City was zoned to a capacity that was not very good, that the infrastructure of the city could really not sustain a level of population that the previous zoning code would allow for. So there was a citywide discussion about how big the city should be. And it's great that we're having this discussion today, because I think a lot of the issues that were talked about in the 1950s are just as valid today, even not more so, and it's long overdue that we've had this discussion. But two things that happened as a result of the new zoning that was adopted in 1961 was there was a limitation on the amount of floor area that you could have within a zoning envelope, and there was also a limitation on the number of units. Prior to 1961, you could just stuff that zoning envelope with as much square footage as you want, and you could stuff that apartment building with as many units as you want. And the city collectively decided then that that was not a good thing, that there was too much bulk, and that having so many units was a bad thing in one building. And it's interesting that in all of the discussions that all of the designs that we've seen this morning, nobody was questioning FAR. Nobody was advocating greater bulk. What they've almost, in every case, were advocating was greater density, like a throwing out of the whole density control mechanism, which is a sea change from where we were in the 1950s. So I think that's And I think that there's a certain amount of validity to that. We are living differently. We are living very differently today than we were in the 1950s. And so it's great that we're beginning this discussion. I think that a lot of what we saw were problems that were related to zoning. There was the amount of density that was a problem in a lot of these schemes, the amount of parking. The Department of City Planning, we actually are looking at parking requirements. We are actively looking at parking requirements in many areas of the city as a way of reducing them. But I got to tell you that parking is an explosive issue. Every single one of these issues, density, parking, buildings in the backyards, 5-foot side yards with windows looking out onto them, every one of those is an explosive issue in the communities. And you have to, in order to change any of this, you have to have the city collectively has to decide that this is what we want to do. And ultimately, it's up to the city council to change these rules. And so ultimately, the amount of energy that goes into these types of forums, these types of discussions, has to end up at convincing the decision makers that, yes, it's long overdue. We need to make these changes, and we need to have different standards that meet the different needs of our population today.
You know, another perennial issue has been the issue of industrial sites. A lot of people say industry is declining, these industrial sites should be rezoned for residential, that would free up cheap land for housing. And then other people say, well, hang on a minute, we need to cultivate manufacturing, we still need those sites. Where do we stand on that issue now?
There are areas of the city that are off limits to rezonings for residential or mixed use, and those are areas that are very important to the city's industrial base. So that's a start, that there are certain red lines drawn around certain areas, no zoning changes there. And then we have this district which is called an MX district. One of the designs that we saw today was in Astoria, was an MX district, which means that you can have a combination of industrial uses, residential uses, and commercial uses all in the same building. And again, that's a sea change from where we were in the 1950s, because when we adopted the 1961 zoning resolution, it was very Euclidean. You had to have your industry over there, you had to have your residences over there, you had to have your businesses over there, and mixing was seen as a very bad thing. Well, we got over that. You know, in the 1980s, we developed this new tool called a mixed-use zoning district, and so you can have all those mixes as long as the industrial uses are not going to be, you know, giving off any poisonous vapors or something. It's okay to live in that building. But one of the problems is that whenever there's a choice between industrial use or residential use, residential usually triumphs. You know, so it's difficult to actually, you know, require that you have a mix of uses. You know, it's one thing to allow it, but it's another to require those mixes.
Right. Bob, let me ask you a question.
Well, there is a thing called Lofts.
Right.
That's true. And I was the lucky commissioner to take over the Loft board.
Right.
And for all of my Loft fans, I'm with you. I mean that sincerely, I really do. Here's a population who ended up moving into a building, and it happens to be in a place called Soho, and they're doing quite well. But there's a whole other group of people that actually legislatures got around the table and did something to ask for, because there are other parts of the city that the same thing is happening. Although it's a little bit different. And we are working through trying to figure out how to allow these people to get protection. Because many of the things that we talk about, no one really wants to talk about these things, right? Except me, which is how do you protect the guy who's living in the space? How do you get the landlord to come in to say, oh yeah, I have an illegal apartment in my basement, I want to legalize it? You know, they're never going to come. So you have to build some framework. So the Loft Board has done that for a set of criteria that the legislature at the state level passed, and we're working through that now. But, you know, I go back to, I think there's a combination of the things that have to happen. One is that we have to continue enforcement, and we have to continue to educate, and the other is that we need to look at a set of things. If you want to reduce the room size, you want to say 150 is too big, what's the number? 130? So make it 130. You want to say that 3 unrelated people can't live together? It's got to be 7 people? Fine. But I don't think that those things are going to give you what Geraldine wants, which is she wants to see a move towards a new model and a new way of living. And I think that that's why it's so difficult. And I challenge, he's so good to be here today to talk about, you know, just think about, there are protections in place to allow laws to be made, and one's called the Euler process. And don't ask me what it stands for, it's just long. But basically what it says is it comes to a community and says, do you agree? We've done all this study and we're going to do these things, and what do you say? So today, you know, there's a possibility that maybe we could take some of those neighborhoods and move them towards something that would allow for something else to be used. But to me, the city does have the opportunity to make some tweaks, but if you want to do something bigger, we need to look for bigger solutions.
Well, let me ask you this then, and this is kind of a process question. So I'm Matthew Besso. I'm just teamed up with Rafi Siegel. I just met him this morning. He's convinced me to build this wacky kibbutz over a parking garage, right? And we're going to do it. So where do they go? What's the process for them to go and get this thing approved?
No, I won't even say what I'm thinking about. No, it was across the river to the other place. But, no, I think that, I mean, they're actually the kibbutz, actually, it works until a point. The opportunity that, the challenge, so you're waiting for me to say it, right?
No, I'm waiting for you to explain the ULIP process that would result in them building.
No, that's a disaster. Sorry. Okay. But
democracy.
Bureaucracy. Anyway, no, what I would say is that when you heat, unfortunately, the design hits up against these two big problems, which is this shared living. And so you could build a bunch of apartments on top of a parking garage in that neighborhood, in fact, I think, and you could add some commercial uses and you could do it. Because I think it's in the right zone. The issue is...
You just said you can do it, guys. Do you hear that? You just said...
However, here's the caveat,
okay.
Which is that, so now what you want to say is we're going to share the kitchens and we're going to share the bathrooms, and we're going to walk through this outdoor space that's sort of heated sort of in nodes, which I really like. I think that's kind of cool. In a bathrobe, I'm not sure. But that shared living allows for people to live differently, which is a huge foreign concept, I think, for a lot of the people that we have to convince to move forward. And so you might be able to take elements of it and take pieces. It's sort of like going to the car show and looking at the car that's on the wall or in the driveway. They are looking for cues of what the public likes and wants. And I think that that's what this, you know, the cones with bringing in the light, I love that. The woman that talked about, you know, you could buy it at Lowe's and build a chimney. I mean, I have a solution for that. You just go to these guys and you say, it doesn't count for floor area, and you'll have one of those cones in every house in Queens.
But they won't be cones.
Well, you know what I mean. But my only point is that you can do a lot of those things. It just, when you hit up against, we're going to share the bathroom and share the kitchen, I think most of you will agree who is in charge. Ask yourself, who is in charge and who's going to police that space? So 5 years from now, 10 years from now, will those residents be protected in a way that they feel comfortable, not that that building gets abandoned because it's a failure? So socially, I think that that's you know, where the supportive housing allows for someone to be in charge and to control and manage the space.
We just have time for one more question, David. Thank you.
Okay, I was hoping to take a couple from the floor, but no, we'll just do one more. Okay, so I've got one more for Matt, which is that the Bloomberg administration prides itself on taking a very pragmatic approach. You know, we try things, they don't work, we abandon them, we try other things. So can you think of some initiatives that have followed that pragmatic approach and have been successful, in your opinion, in generating more affordable housing and a broader range of choices?
The first thing that comes to mind is actually just the overall housing plan in and of itself. Not that we have tried things and that we have in turn failed, but that much of what we've attempted to do, rather than simply throwing things against the wall, is to create a measure of flexibility in our plans for the creation of affordable housing that allow us to move when the market moves and to be nimble when the market is nimble, or when the market is undergoing dynamic change. So for instance, obviously we started a plan during the upmarket with an expectation that the vast majority of what we were going to be doing would be easy to finance and would be focused on primarily new construction. The market crashed in 2008, and it became apparent to us that we had to, given changes in the financing and liquidity market, we had to, again, be nimble and think about the fact that now we had to not only get to the end of the plan, but also realign our objectives under the plan to make sure that through a down period, we were actually protecting a lot of the capital investment that had occurred through this administration, both on the public and the private side. And so that's an instance in which we have taken plans and architecture that was designed to be nimble and very effectively repositioned those plans in order to meet and achieve our ends, even if conditions were changing on the ground.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Certainly not the easiest time to be building affordable housing, anyway, right? So
we'll get there.
Okay. Are we out of time?
Yes.
Okay.
Thank you
very
so much.
Thank you all.
I wish it could go on all afternoon.
Okay.